When Shelly Sullivan was a little girl, she could never have imagined the path her life would take. But how does a little girl go from princess of the castle to life at the bottom?
To not use the cliche looking for love in all the wrong places, but that's exactly what ended up happening because of the lack of the father figure in my life, that lack of love and acceptance and, whatever, it basically sent me to find that love, that acceptance, that family within, the teenagers of my day.
At 13, Shelly was already pursuing drugs and alcohol and spent time in foster care because she kept running away from home. By the time she was 16, her life had taken a dangerous turn.
I ended up leaving with a couple of men who promised me riches beyond belief, and promised me that if I went with them that I could make all kinds of money being a dancer, an exotic dancer, and that they would show me the ropes and introduce me to whoever and whatever and get me started. So within, a couple weeks of leaving with them, I realized that I was basically their hostage. They threatened to hurt me severely if I ever thought of leaving.
Shelly escaped, but soon moved away from home again, this time to live with a boyfriend in Vancouver. When that ended badly, she was determined to make it on her own, so she continued to strip for a living, staying with whomever would put her up for the night.
Probably about the end of that first year and a half, I started getting into cocaine, which is something that I thought that I would have never done previously when I was a teenager. And then I started hanging around with a bunch of people who did a lot of heroin. And so, of course, thought I'd give that a try as well. And that really ended up being one of my biggest downfalls.
Soon Shelly's body was so ravaged by the drug, she was fired from dancing. But she had to feed her habit, so she and her boyfriend at the time began to deal drugs.
I'd probably say for about 6 months or so we were selling drugs. But it got to the point where my boyfriend, and I included, but more so him, he got arrested all the time.
With the police effectively shutting down their drug business, Shelly had to come up with a plan.
At that point in my life, I was waking up every day and needing that fix, that drug, that needle in my arm, in order for me to even get out of bed. So that night, I did what I had to do on the street for the very first time, and I won't lie to you, it was the most awful thing that I can remember going through. And so anyway, I continued.
Shelly finally hit rock bottom when a fight with her boyfriend turned so violent he almost choked her to death. She escaped and ran right to the nearest payphone.
Like, middle of the night, and called my mother, crying my eyes out, and basically told her exactly everything that had happened in that 3 years. And, what I had done and where I was up until that point. I was on drugs and I was working the streets and whatever. And I just pleaded with her and said, I need to come home. I want to come home.
Arriving home, she immediately checked herself into a clinic.
That week in rehab was probably the hardest thing that I've ever had to go through. There's been lots of things that I've done in my life. The first time I went out on the street, and first time I did drugs, but that week in rehab, coming off of the drugs, was the hardest thing I've ever done.
That experience convinced her to never touch drugs again, but her destructive behavior didn't stop. She was still drinking heavily and working as an exotic dancer to pay bills. One night in a maritime bar, she met and fell in love with a young rocker named Ken and moved to Toronto to live with him. But Ken wasn't interested in God at all. His entire focus was to achieve fame and fortune as a rock star, with the lifestyle that went along with it. But he says even in those days, thoughts of what he calls something more crept in.
I can remember, when all your friends are gone home and when when it's just you and you're alone laying in your bed, I can remember saying, this can't be all there is to life. There's got to be, I can't see myself being older and still doing the same thing. And so I think even at that point, God was starting to work on me.
And God was soon to become a huge part of their lives. Ken's brother was killed in a motorcycle accident, and the pastor who led the funeral helped them realize life could end at any moment.
It really made us start thinking about the reality of God. It started to make us think about the fact that we weren't indestructible, and we started to have questions about God.
He and Shelly moved back to the Maritimes to be close to family. But it was when one of the band members committed his life to God that things really began to change.
And they needed a lead guitar player at the church, and so Dave started phoning and harassing me, and I didn't want any part of it. But eventually, after him calling enough, we ended up going out and seeing this church that, I had preconceived ideas of what church was about, but it really was a fun church, and they did things differently than what I had thought. And so we just enjoyed it there and hung out and ended up, giving our lives to the Lord.
Ken was changing too, and quickly finding a profound sense of calling.
I went and talked to my pastor, and I said, this is really weird. I've only been saved for a couple months, but I feel like God's telling me that we're going to be in ministry. And the pastor said, one thing I'll tell you about God is that if he really spoke it will continue to intensify. That feeling will only get stronger. And that's exactly how it's been. I mean, God has just constantly shown us, the next step and the next step and the next step, and it's gotten better and better.
The Sullivans' faith journey eventually led them here to Mahone Bay, Nova Scotia. In 2005, they launched a congregation here called Bethel Outreach Church.
God's continuing to do amazing stuff in us and through us and opening doors for us, even having you guys come here. And to be honest, when we look at where we were to where we are today, it certainly is not a prideful thing. It's a very humbling thing. And it makes me want to weep to think that God would look upon two people who were in those circumstances and to bring them out and now to be in the place that we are. It's an amazing thing.
12 years have passed now, and looking back, they can hardly recognize the young Shelly and Ken who met in a maritime bar.
I look back on my past, and I don't look back on it in shame anymore. I used to feel, weird about it, I certainly, I'm worth something now. I know that because I'm, one of God's children, I'm like there's nothing better. And viewing myself as how he sees me.
God has just wrecked me. I'll never be the same again. And there's absolutely nothing negative I could say, and he's turned my whole world upside down, and I'd never ever go back. Some people think about, the good old days, and remember when, I don't think that at all, because I think today is the worst day of my life, because tomorrow's going to be so much better. And today is amazing. So I'm not saying today's bad, but I know that there's always more in God. There's always deeper we can go.
The little girl named Shelly, who dreamed of a beautiful life, may have been shocked by the horrible chapter that occurred all those years ago, but she also couldn't have imagined the transformation that would follow.
Never in a million years would I have ever thought that I would be, a quote-unquote pastor's wife or a pastor myself. Yeah, that would have been the furthest thing from my mind. But, again, he can take anybody and do whatever he wants with them. And he did. He plucked us out of, the clay and just transformed us.
Free of shame and helping others to be free, the Sullivans can't wait to see what God has planned for them next. But in going public with their painful past, their prayer is that others in similar dark circumstances can find hope for change. In Mahone Bay, Nova Scotia, Cheryl Weber, 100 Huntley Street.